But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In today's episode of the History in Motion podcast, we pick up the story of Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds. From his triumphant return to France after the American Revolution to the chaos of 1789, the Reign of Terror, prison cells in Austria, and his final years as an elder statesman, Lafayette's life is a window into both the glory and the tragedy of the French Revolution. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we're here with the Marquis de Lafayette for the second half of his life. After we've spent some time with him in the American Revolution, he's come back home and he's ready to start Revolution number 2, and this is the French Revolution. And what's going to be really interesting today is the first part was a pretty triumphal moment for Lafayette. Goes to America, he wins the war, he's best friends with George Washington and all the founding fathers. He's treated as, one of their own. And you think coming back to France that he'd be able to replicate a lot of these things, but we're going to see very quickly how the French Revolution is slightly more complicated than the American Revolution, and alliances are changing all the time, and it's very, very difficult for someone like Lafayette to fit into this new world. So we'll see how that goes, but he's on to Revolution number 2 here.
I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it seems like his favorite pastimes were taking part or advancing revolutions.
Yeah, without question. And we'll see later in life too, as all of these revolutions that are happening, because the 1800s is like the century of revolutions, especially in Europe. He's always supporting these small revolutions, big revolutions, and he's always cheering for the end of monarchies, and he wants the liberal liberty, all the things that America are built on. He wants to see that across Europe. So yeah, he definitely likes revolution, but he's, I think, smart enough to notice that he doesn't like disorder and chaos and bloody revolution. He wants to see the, nobility go away and all of those things. So we'll see what happens as time goes on. But, with what we know about the French Revolution, it's definitely not that straightforward. And it's, going to see a lot of people die, and it's going to see Lafayette be kind of, maybe thinking that his name is next to come to the guillotine at some point.
I think you touched on a very apt point there about his form of revolution, and I think it's a contention that we'll see across this episode. I definitely saw it in my research, looking at the context about how he kind of sees revolution taking place. And I think just from what we've learned about him thus far, most of these revolutions end up with some violent overtures, intentional, some unintentional, but I don't think he ever actually wanted that. And he does a very good job, sometimes to certain degrees, about kind of walking that tightrope on what it means to be a revolutionary, but still have some consistency and stability in order with the nobility, particularly in France, which we'll get into about probably halfway through this episode.
Definitely. And we'll really start to see too how he's viewed in France and America today. America, he is on the levels of George Washington and some of these great founding fathers, maybe not quite to that level, but, in that tier. But when you look at him in France, I was just recently in Paris walking around, and there's statues to all these great French people, but Lafayette's kind of tucked away. You can find some stuff on him, but you kind of have to go looking for it, which I thought was a bit odd at first. But as you can see how he kind of manages through this revolution, what happens when he dies, he's never really, I would say, celebrated by either side of the political spectrum. He's very famous. People know him. People respect him, but he manages to poke the bear in enough ways that, when he dies, the king isn't going to make a big statue of him, or the assembly is going to build some sort of great monument to him or name something after him. He's just they kind of just see him as along for the ride, and we'll see how he tries to play both sides a little bit and how it ends up kind of biting him in the butt a little bit as he goes through all of this. So to jump into his life he's come back at the age of 25. So this is the crazy part. We just did a whole episode on him and he's only 25. So this episode, we're going to have a lot to go through, but he's back from France after the revolution and he's come back very triumphal. And this was the thing for him. He wanted to be, at the head of an army. He wanted that military glory and he's got all of it. And he's come back and right away, he's seen as this hero of two worlds. He's got an opportunity to take some control in the French army. But really what his core thing is he's seen this liberty experiment, if you will, work in America. And he wants to bring a lot of that stuff back. And he's starting to put some of these ideals into action. So one thing that he does is he quietly launches an experiment to prove that slavery is not feasible from an economic standpoint. So there's a plantation that he purchases in French Guyana on the condition that the workers be freed and employed as paid laborers. So basically he's saying, look, if I'm going to make them paid laborers and I'm going to prove that this is going to work, you don't need to have, proper slaves in this sort of situation. And George Washington even praises him and he says, this is a generous and noble proof of your humanity. And so this is something that he funds at personal expense, and he tries to really just start to chip away at this older regime and, talks about emancipation. And we start to see him push more of these liberal ideas into this kind of old regime within France, which he is coming from. He's rich and he's able to do these things because he's from the old regime, but he's trying to start to see some change in France. And one thing that he knows he can do very quickly is emancipation, just because he's been in America, liberty for all men are created equal, except if you're an enslaved African. He understands that doesn't line up well with what America's saying, and it doesn't align well with what he believes. So, this is his first kind of, we'll say, noble kind of scheme, I guess you would say, to try and make things a little bit more away from that old regime. And he's going to continue to do that, not just with slaves, but within France in general.
It's an interesting point because the way that I kind of interpret this, even from the beginning, right? So he's welcomed back as the hero of two worlds. He's, dancing with Queen Marie Antoinette. He's attending the royal court, but he's also a revolutionary who's pushing revolutionary ideas and pressing for a constitutional monarchy. So his prominence and ideals obviously make him very influential and put him in center stage for the royal court and in France in general. But I think you can already see the delicate position that he's put himself in as the old regime begins to crack in France.
Absolutely. And it doesn't take long for this to happen. So, right about 3 or 4 years after he comes back, he's appointed to this Assembly of Notables by the king. And really what's happening in France is financial collapse is about to happen. Really, this all started from these financial reports, if you will, that were put together that were incredibly misleading, and everybody who was kind of higher up in the government said, oh, great, everything's fine. And then there was also some silly things like funding overseas wars, funding the Americans, probably not the best decision by the French, but they did it anyways. And there was also kind of some advice to the royal family. Look, keep spending lavishly, because if you show that you're rich, people will think we're rich and we'll be able to keep the masses from freaking out, but also it'll be easier for us to get loans and stuff from private citizens because it'll show that we have a lot of money. But now the chickens have come home to roost. And it's really in this situation where this Assembly of Notables has come together. The first thing is we got to figure out the economy. But this is where we're starting to see pushes towards the government, specifically the king, to start to look at more, moving towards that constitutional monarchy, moving away from just the king's decision is final. And some of the things that Lafayette starts to do is he's starting to look at, can we have a constitution? Can we do some of these things? He's starting to look at the Catholic majority within France. So he actually carries one motion where he wants Protestant citizens of France to be basically not totally equal. Like eventually that's where he wants to get to, but there's some things where there were some laws that were making things specifically criminal that Protestants would do. And he's trying to just find how can we keep things equal. And so the king accepts this and things are starting to move in the right direction here. But really this financial breakdown is really at the heart of what's happening here. And this assembly gets together and they basically say, look, all of this stuff is happening, but we need a constitution. So they swear something called the tennis court oath, where essentially they go out on what is considered a tennis court. And the assembly gets together and they say, look, we will not disband this assembly until a constitution is created. And that's kind of their oath. But you can already start to see that Lafayette has one version of things. The more left-wing, more radicals have one idea. The more, I guess, people aligned with the king have one idea as well. And so they're all going to have to agree. And this crisis is forcing them to agree. But we'll start to see very quickly that things are starting to, they're coming together in a way where this can blow up very, very quickly, because no one's all coming together being like, right, we need to have a constitutional monarchy. It's like, no, we need to fix something. And a lot of people are just like, hey, let's just fix it and, get back to the way things were before.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I think just to double down on that, I know you covered the costliness of the wars. There's a very inefficient tax system, lavish spending by the monarchy to essentially keep appearances. You have poor harvest, economic strain. So you have, one component of the precipice of why the French Revolution is going to kick off and erupt, essentially. But tied to that, you also have social inequality. So we have to remember that France's rigid estate system placed very heavy tax burdens on peasants and commoners. You'll hear the term third estate tossed around when you're talking about the majority of the French population, and then tie that with economic hardships tied to those poor harvests, severe financial crises for the reasons we just outlined, and then there's a political breakdown. King Louis XVI is kind of indecisive in the face of these crises. He calls for reform, running headlong into the entrenched interests of the nobility and parliament. So these are the high courts, but it doesn't really give representation for the third estate. And then, interestingly enough, and this is kind of cuts into the first episode as well, which is this kind of intellectual fervor that's happening. Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Lafayette are spreading new ideas about rights, sovereignty, equality, and giving a powerful ideological framework to those very popular grievances. So in short, the revolution, happened because of one, a bankrupt monarchy, a very resentful and unequal social order, and an emboldened public influence by the new political ideas, which all kind of collided in this, mashup of things.
Yeah, it really is this coming together of just all these different ideas, traditional conservatism, more liberal ideas, the Enlightenment, the radicalness that we're going to see in a bit, all kind of coming together around this crisis. And, little silly things like, how are we even going to vote is already one of the main things. Is, does everybody get one vote? Does the nobility get an extra vote? Well, how do we deal with the church in this sense? What's their role as part of these three estates? And it's just, you can start to see already that no one's going to agree on anything very quickly. So you could, like I said, there's, the volcano is starting to smoke a little bit here, and we'll see very quickly, when that full eruption happens. But before that, Lafayette continues to do some things that are very aligned with things we've already talked about today. So he joins, along with his wife Adrienne, in a new society called Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which is essentially an abolitionist group that is pushing for the end of the slave trade. And so we're starting to see this abolitionist movement really starting to kick off around Europe. And this is one of the key spots in France that this is starting. And then he also joins with a few nobles, something called the Society of 30. And they're essentially plotting how to transform France's Estate General into a force for major change. So this is essentially the coming together of people from all over the country who are trying to move the governments, in the right direction. But, that turns into a national assembly. And this is where the French Revolution can get a little bit complicated, just with all these assemblies and people coming together and what do they mean, and they turn into different things. But this Estates General essentially comes to Versailles, and Lafayette takes his seat as the deputy of the second estate, which is the nobility. But, he quickly emerges as this champion of the rights of man. So the first thing he says is, hey, I'm here as the chair of the second estate of the nobility. My first thing is, we want to get rid of our noble privilege. And so some nobles are going, are you crazy? What do you mean get rid of our noble privilege? This is awesome having this noble privilege. We don't have to pay taxes. We have all these rights. We were first appointed for a whole bunch of things. Life's pretty good. But he has a lot of allies and reformist nobles who recognize that the third estate is going to get more power, and it's just what they believe. They believe that they should have rights for all, and they're starting to look at religious freedom, abolitionism as well in this new assembly. And so Lafayette's inspired by what he's seen in America, and he presents a draft, what he calls the Declarations of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which is a pretty bold Bill of Rights proclaiming universal liberty and equality for all, which he actually talks to Thomas Jefferson about to get some advice on, how he should do this. So these actions position Lafayette as really this, which I guess you could call moderate, depending on where you're looking at. Some people would think, this is very radical equality for all. Like, what are you, crazy? You can't do something like that. But it's definitely not more on the, we need to tear the head off the king today. And he's definitely seen as this like liberal aristocrat, which is a great prestige for him because he's able to talk to the people, but he's able to talk to the king at this point, and nobody's really looking at him as, oh, he's some crazy person who's just, you know, gonna do whatever the king tells him to do, or he's gonna, you know, if we let him too close to the king, he's gonna, you know, start a coup and overthrow the monarchy. He's trying to find that balance, and at this point, he seems to be doing, you know, a pretty good job at bringing all of that together, and he's got a lot of allies, even within the nobility, that, you know, agree with what he's doing.
Yeah, I think the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is obviously a pretty influential document. So it's adopted August 26, 1789. And in many ways, it kind of touches on those intellectual, you know, waves that we discussed earlier. And I think just at a high level, some of those core principles, you know, equality, natural rights, sovereignty, law and justice, law must apply equally to all, protecting rights and forbidden arbitrary actions. That's a pretty big one. Freedom of speech and religion. Taxation should be equally shared according to one's means. That's pretty stark relative to what's been happening historically up to this point. Due process, property, and in many ways, this kind of becomes the cornerstone of French constitutional law. And even if we're thinking about modern impacts of this, you know, this influenced later documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was made almost, 200 years after the fact, and it's still cited in French courts today. So this is not just any document. This is a pretty pivotal cornerstone piece of, I don't want to call it legislation, but like a declaration that has a foothold on how we should govern ourselves.
Absolutely. And again, you can see the influence on the Declaration of Independence and the American Bill of Rights and the things that they're saying about their society. And you can tell that you can see Jefferson's fingerprints on it, and you can see Lafayette's inspiration there. But this would be a very boring story if Lafayette went, I have this new Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. Everyone went, man, that's fantastic. Let's get that signed and figure things out, and everything will be good. He puts that forward. Everything's exciting. But the very next day, they dismiss the finance minister, Jacques Necker. So Jacques Necker, everyone kind of really respected this guy because he's your typical, finance accountant guy. He's going to get to the bottom of what's happening with all the numbers. He's definitely a reformer. He understands the issues that the crown is going through and what needs to change. And a lot of people were kind of looking to him to say, look, Necker, we need you to tell us how you're going to fix things. We're going to listen to you. But he's dismissed by the king. And so there's a few reasons for that. One, there's, I would say, some royalists probably getting to the king's ears saying, we got to get rid of this guy because he's going to ruin our noble privilege, and he's going to recommend that you as a king lose some of your power and all of those things. So that's one thing. But the other big thing, this is the late 1700s. We just talked about all these interesting reforms. He's not French. He's actually Swiss. So we can't trust this guy. The main argument of, I'm not letting a Swiss man tell me how we should redo the government. Maybe he's working for our enemies and he's going to find a way to destroy us from within. And unfortunately, that's sometimes a very powerful sentiment at this time. It's just funny because we talk about all this new kind of interesting things that are happening, but at the end of the day, old-fashioned xenophobia sometimes will win. So he's dismissed and Paris freaks out. There's a lawyer who assembles about maybe around 1,000 armed insurgents, starts going around Paris, causing a bit of trouble, protesting, making it really, trying to make their voices heard, but in a pretty violent way. So the king has the royal army surround Paris, and this is followed by the storming of the Bastille. So now we're talking proper revolution now. And again, this is what happens with the French Revolution. Things are quiet, and then it just, like I said, the volcano is smoking, and then, you add one more little catalyst to it, and then bang, the Bastille is stormed, and it becomes really that symbolic start to the French Revolution. If we're going to put a starting point on it, definitely there's many decisions that led up to this. But if you say, hey, when's the start from a violent standpoint, in the way that's kind of in the common mind, it's definitely the day the Bastille falls.
It's interesting, the storming of the Bastille, because I think I read that there wasn't even that many people imprisoned in the Bastille at that point when it was raided. I think there was less than 10 prisoners, but it was also a fortress for gunpowder, and military style weapons, essentially. But it really is kind of symbolic of this kicking off. And then I think that the same day, Lafayette is then appointed commander of the newly formed Paris National Guard in direct response to the storming of the Bastille.
And I think this is perfect for Lafayette, right? He's now in command of troops, citizen militia, but still he's in charge of troops. But his job is just to maintain order. It's not to take what the king says and destroy this revolution. It's not to support the revolutionary. So he's in a very challenging spot, though, because he's going to have people within that militia who are very loyal to the king, the people who hate the king, but he's got to get them to understand that this is a citizen militia and your job is to keep Paris calm and safe. That's your job. And so it's a very, very challenging job, and it's not going to make any friends along the way. But during this time, he makes the most important decision that will change France forever, more in a symbolic way. But it's the French flag, essentially, comes out from what he's decided here. So the colors of blue and red, they represent Paris. And that's what a lot of revolutionaries were pinning on themselves. You know, the red and blue of Paris were the people. You know, the militia used it when they were storming the Bastille. But the white represents the monarchy. And so Lafayette has this idea that we're going to put on all of our uniforms as a citizen militia. We're going to put red and blue on the outside and white in the middle. And there's a few different ways to look at it. One being, hey, everything is coming together. We're representing both sides. But there's also a little bit of an element of, you know, the king's in the middle. He's still the most important, but he's surrounded by the people. And he can't really go anywhere without working well with the people. But we still recognize that he is our leader and will continue to be our leader for the time going on. And it sticks. And that's why we have the French flag today. And I think it's just a cool little thing that he's done. And it's very clever because this, like I said, this National Guard needs to represent all three estates, all people, and it really kind of symbolizes what Lafayette's been trying to do this whole time.
And maybe just another footnote on the National Guard. So it's interesting. At its origin, it was really only opened up, or limited to, I should say, to quote unquote citizens in good standing. So essentially this meant men who paid a certain level of taxes, which gave the Guard a very, at least at its genesis point, a very distinct bourgeois character. And then as the revolution deepens, the composition and loyalties kind of shift. So by the early 1790s, you know, pressure from the populace kind of loosens the property restrictions, and then their ranks begin to swell with working class Parisians. And then, you know, sections of the Guard joined in on radical actions like the storming of Tuileries in 1792. They, you know, sections of them would help topple the monarchy, you know, eventually. But as power changed hands, the Guard often found itself kind of pulled in different directions, sometimes defending moderate revolutionaries, sometimes aligning with popular uprisings, but ultimately it kind of turns into this conservative force used to suppress radical unrest. So it's more than just a militia. It came to embody the revolution's kind of core tensions in many ways, which is this kind of struggle for order and liberty, property and equality, while balancing moderation and radicalism. And I think even, you know, early into this episode, we're seeing kind of this disorganization, this chaos that is just hand in hand with the French Revolution. And I think the Paris National Guard is kind of like a microcosm of how many tensions and ways things can get pulled. And, you know, Lafayette, again, in this very unique position, being an insider to the bourgeois, but still still trying his best to represent, you know, the working class Parisian at the same time.
Absolutely. And like you said, this chaos of everything that's going on, there's parts of this revolution where nobody really even knows who's technically in charge of anything. And that's where this militia kind of comes in, is they can kind of bridge that gap. And for a time, people almost kind of see Lafayette as someone to look up to, and definitely not someone who'd replace the king, but almost kind of on the same level in terms of, at this moment in time, I'm going to go to Lafayette if I need something done, because A, he's got all these troops behind him, but also he's the one who can work between all the different factions here. Now, it's a very temporary position in the sense that he's got this control, and we'll see how that changes very quickly. But that's kind of where he's at. And one little thing that he does interesting here after the Bastille falls is he actually writes a letter to George Washington, and he gives him a few gifts. He says, "Give me leave, my dear general, to present to you with a picture of the Bastille just as it looked after I ordered its demolition, with the main key of the fortress of despotism. It is a tribute which I owe as a son to my adoptive father, as a missionary of liberty to its patriarch." So he writes this nice little letter to Washington, which again, just to show that relationship is still very strong. They're consistently in contact, and he still sees him as his adopted father. But what's very cool is if you go to Mount Vernon today, you can actually see the key to the Bastille that Lafayette sent to Washington as a gift, which I think is kind of cool, just to say like, hey, you know, we tore this thing down. It was a symbol of this old regime and we've destroyed it. And, you know, I want to send you this because, you've inspired me more into, moving into this more liberal world. And it's kind of a little cool footnote, and we'll see him in Washington go back and forth a lot as time goes on. So, like I said, time goes on. The Bastille falls. Lafayette's trying to get some order in the city. This whole meeting at Versailles of trying to figure out if there's a constitution and what's happening is going back and forth, and there's some progress, then it falls apart, and nobody can agree on anything. And so now more violence is going to start. There's a hungry mob of Parisian women who are just, again, it's the bread riots, right? This is the classic thing of the revolution. They're hearing about all these rumors going on. The prices of bread have exploded. They've somehow got their hands on a cannon, and they've started to march to Versailles. So they marched the 12 miles to the royal palace with a massive mob demanding bread and for the royal family to move back to Paris. Now, this is a key thing. If you remember, we talked about this in the first episode. The royal family centuries before moved out of Paris to Versailles to kind of get away from the people. And so now they're saying, great, you're living in this palace while we're starving in Paris. You don't even know what's going on. You're going to come back to Paris. Now, this is tricky for Lafayette. He's got two things he's got to look at here. Well, I support the people for sure. They don't have bread. The king isn't giving them what they want. They want liberty. I absolutely support them. But this is an angry mob. I have to protect the king and his family. So it's kind of this tense standoff that happens. And, it gets to a point where it looks like the crowd is going to try to break into the Bastille, into Versailles. And so there's actually a very famous scene where the crowd is demanding that Marie Antoinette come out, that the king come out. They come out, they boo, they hiss, they do all of these things. But Lafayette does something quite interesting here. He steps onto the balcony with Marie Antoinette, and he just very eloquently kisses the queen's hand, and the crowd goes crazy. Like, it's just this level of, look, Lafayette, we know he's our guy. He's going to support us as people, but he's still showing this respect for the queen. And for some reason, it kind of calms things down. Now, there's obviously a lot more troops around, and things are, mobs will find their way to calm down. And especially that, they came here looking for things, but ultimately, though, they still had one demand. And part of what calms us down is the king and queen agree that they're going to come back to Paris. And so this, it's not just Lafayette kissing the hand. They're going, oh, great, everything's great, we're going to move back. Their main demand has been satisfied, and things calm down, but now it's time for the royal family to go back to Paris.
I think this is such an interesting event for a couple of reasons. One, you could almost read this as if they are kind of political prisoners being forced to stay in Paris, at, ground zero. But then for Lafayette, I can only imagine what these factions are thinking. They're probably giving him a bit of a side eye at this point, because you have, royalists who are probably mistrusting him for his revolutionary sympathies. They're, whispering that the Marquis and his National Guard are practically rebels in uniform. And then you have radical patriots who are growing, I imagine, very suspicious that Lafayette was too protective of the king, which is kind of demonstrated in the example you just laid out. Maybe he's this kind of false friend of the people, and now he's getting it from both sides. And I think, this is that political tightrope he continues to walk. And the example we just talked about, I think, it just perfectly encapsulates it.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head here. There's a lot of side-eyeing going on, and there's even these, all right, Julius Caesar, all right, Oliver Cromwell, you've got the army, and you're very popular. We know what you're doing. You're just going to wait for your chance, and you're going to kick in the king's door and say, I'm the new king now. I've got the power. And he always denies this. And from what we know about Lafayette, it'd be the last thing that he would think about doing. Even when, he's asked to take higher command, he always says no. But he's definitely getting a lot of this. And you're absolutely right, too, about the king and the queen. This is not some, hey, we're going to move back to Paris because we like the palace there. It's a little bit different or something like that. No, they're prisoners, 100%. They're living in one of the older palaces, but they're prisoners. And they can't just go back to Versailles. They can't even leave the city without permission from some sort of National Assembly government sort of thing that's happening here. Like I said, it changes so often that it's not worth going into. But essentially, the people and some of the more radicals are starting to get into power here. But there's some exciting things happening. It's now the first anniversary of Bastille Day. Lafayette is like at the absolute zenith of his popularity, and he organizes essentially the first Bastille Day celebration. It's designed to be a festival of national unity, and he does it on the Champ de Mars, and it's a crowd of 100,000 people show up in the pouring rain, and it's just supposed to be a celebration of, France, really, and what it's going to become, and really what it is today. Is Bastille Day is a celebration for the country that it is. But this is a big risk, right? The royalists are looking at him going, are you nuts? You just took hordes of undisciplined people, brought them close to where the king is, and just let them have a celebration, and You didn't think anything was going to kick off. And then the Jacobins, who we'll get into more, is really this very radical left-leaning side of this. If the royalists are on the right side, the Jacobins are way on the left side. They looked at this and said, oh, this is just Lafayette. We're seeing your royalist tendencies. You're celebrating, France and the king and all of these things. And you're not really for the common people like we are. And so, again, he's sitting in the middle and he's pleasing nobody. And so this is kind of where he is. And he's still trying to push for change. And he's leading the representatives of France to take an oath to a new constitution. So they actually have an altar at the center of the field where the Bastille was demolished. And Lafayette swears on behalf of the National Guard to always be faithful to the nation, the law, and the king. So again, this balanced loyalty that he's trying to go through here. So the king, he says, yeah, don't worry, I'm gonna uphold this constitution. They have this spectacular ceremony with the king in person, music, banners, everybody having a good time. And the king essentially says, absolutely, we're going to have a peaceful constitutional monarchy. All right. This should be nice and simple. We'll get this thing wrapped up and we'll call an end to this revolution. But you have to remember, the king is out there. He's saying all the right things, but he's a prisoner. He would have to give up immense power. He's got a lot of royalists who are supporting him. He doesn't want to do a lot of these things. He understands the situation that's happening here, but, we're going to see very quickly that this is going to boil over again. And despite the fact everybody's saying the right things in these situations, behind closed doors, there are so many factions that are coming out here. So like we talked about, there's the royalists, people like Lafayette who are a little bit more in the middle. But then the Jacobins who are on the very left side. But now you're starting to see within the royalists, within, the very left-leaning, within the moderates, multiple factions are starting to break apart here. So this isn't just three distinct factions. It's maybe hundreds, if you were to break it down to some level, of different groups forming who have different ideas on what they want France to become. And if they're not going to get what they want, they're going to start to put things down. They're going to get angry. There's going to be a whole bunch of things that are happening. And we're going to start to see that things are not moving in the right direction. People are getting angry. And, the king, for all the things that he's saying, really doesn't want to do this constitutional monarchy, at least in the way that, Lafayette is portraying to the people.
Yeah, in terms of kind of, who's involved at this point and, which parties are kind of on the forefront of this, I guess like from a bird's eye view, there's kind of three, right? There's the constitutional monarchists, or kind of the moderates. This is Lafayette. This is the people that believe in like the middle path. They believed a reformed monarchy could stabilize France. They hoped, war against some other European powers to rally the nation, strengthen the king, kind of marginalize the radicals. But we'll see, by 1792-ish, their position is somewhat collapsing. And then to your point, Paul, the Jacobins and the Montagnards, essentially these are the radicals in the assembly. They are growing in power by channeling this popular anger. For them, setbacks in war confirm the suspicions that the king and his supporters were conspiring with foreign monarchies to suppress any internal radical revolution to, overthrow the monarchy. Because from a European perspective, there are monarchs pretty much everywhere. So what kind of precedent are we going to set if the monarch in France falls, and what's going to happen, for us here at home? And then you have, the Paris Commune and the Sans-Culottes. These are the people of Paris. They are increasingly radicalized. They distrust both the monarchy and the moderates like Lafayette. They're the ones who are facing the economic hardship, the food shortages, the fears of foreign invasion, and this is pushing them towards direct action. And then, these groups kind of illustrate this polarization that's going to come to its kind of crescendo point in 1792.
Yeah, it's a really difficult spot to be in with, all this change. And like you mentioned, all of these different groups, and everybody's going to have their way of looking at things. And it starts right away. The royalists have a protect the king, whatever you want to call it, sort of event where they all show up and they surround the palace and basically say, we've heard that the king is going to be, there's assassinations or something's going to happen. So we're here to protect him. But you can't just have a bunch of guys showing up with weapons standing around the palace, because now it's going to look like one of two things. One, you're going to try to do like a counter revolution and you're actually arming people who are supporting the king. Or maybe there's something a little bit more sinister here. Maybe they are trying to get the king to do what they want, and they're essentially holding him prisoner while he's being held prisoner by the people. And so Lafayette he's dealing with something outside Paris. He has to come back in and basically talk these people down, saying like, we're in charge here when it comes to protection. You can't be doing this. And eventually things kind of go away. There was a ask by the king. He would leave Paris every year to go to an area just outside of Paris to celebrate Easter. And as a very deeply religious man, the king, we think he wasn't doing anything more than I just need to go here. Lafayette agreed, but the National Guard said, no, we're going to disobey your direct order, Lafayette, and not escort the king out for Easter because we think if he leaves Paris, he's going to run away, and we're not going to have that. So this is the first time we can see Lafayette's, the National Guard, they're not loyal to Lafayette, they're loyal to their ideals. And in this sense, they said, no, we're not going to do this. And so Lafayette, what can you do? He says, all right, sorry, King, you're going to have to stay. And maybe the National Guard had a point because this is when the flight to Varennes happens. And we talked about this when we did a Marie Antoinette episode, but essentially the king attempts to flee France under the cover of darkness and essentially get out of Paris, get out of the country and rally himself with counter-revolutionary forces and come back and crush this thing because he realizes that he's in big trouble right now. And if he stays in Paris, he could be executed, or he could just be essentially a prisoner for the rest of his life. So the royal family escapes. They're eventually caught and then brought back. But this is not just a disaster for the king. It might even be worse for Lafayette, because in this situation, Lafayette is now seen in a few different ways. One, either you were in on it. You were helping the king because you've always had those royalist sentiments. You must have been helping the king, and you got lucky that he got caught, because if things didn't go the way they did, he wouldn't have been caught and you would have supported his counter-revolutionary ways of working. Or the other way, this guy has no idea what he's doing. How do you let the king escape? You've been talking about how you're going to support the people, but you let this guy escape. You don't know what you're doing. And it's just so many perfect ways to attack him. Lafayette tries to claim credit for recapturing the family, but it's just not a good look for him. And both sides have a grievance with him at this point, and Lafayette's made enough enemies at this point that they're going to start using this as a way to discredit him and try to strip him of as much influence as they can.
Yeah, if this is post capture of the king, and it's interesting because this is on the post of the Champ de Mars Massacre, which kind of takes him, throws him off of the good graces of the Parisian people. Contemporary accounts claim that 50 were killed on that massacre, including women and children. A lot of public outrage, and he essentially, after this, resigned as the command of the National Guard. And then when he comes back to kind of delegate, he actually is traveling back and forth from the front on the war with Austria to Paris to plead with the assembly to restore order and protect the king. And to your point, Paul, this backfires because who are his loyalties with? Where do his loyalties lie? And I think this is a question that all of these other parties continue to, keep on the top of their minds. Like, who is this guy? Can we trust him? And what are his actual intentions? Because he's so committed to this kind of middle way of doing things with stability and minimizing violence and chaos. But ultimately, he's stretched so far between these two kind of counter ideas that something's going to boil over at any point. And it does. And, it not only will result in massive violence, but it really does discredit him to all of the parties involved.
Absolutely. And you're right about this Champ de Mars massacre. Like, this is the first time we really see the National Guard open fire on the crowd. And there's, reasons why this happens, but it even gets to the point where the crowd, after they disperse, an angry mob goes to Lafayette's house. He's not there, but Adrienne and his daughter are there, basically trying to get into the house and do God knows what. And thankfully a group of passing cavalry come by and clear apart the mob. But, these are just like, it's getting even personal now, right? They want Lafayette's head on a pike. It's at least after this. So like you said, he resigns, but he's writing to Jefferson, and Jefferson says something to him, that really this kind of warns Lafayette a little bit. He says, we're not to expect to be translated from despotism to liberty in a feather bed. Basically saying, you're not going to go between these two versions of what you want versus what it is in a nice, clean, smooth way. And he really needs to be careful here because he's at this point where he's going to be in some trouble. And so, like you said, he resigns. He's now working with the French army to fight off the Austrians who are trying to invade, which again just adds to more of, Marie Antoinette is from Austria. There's all these different things that are happening. But he's writing a lot from the front, and he's writing back to the National Assembly, and he's saying, you got to get this place under control, being Paris. He's like, the radicalism is going crazy. These Jacobin clubs are popping up all over the place, and they're getting very radical, and they're starting to get violent. He starts calling them anarchists, and he keeps writing and is saying to the assembly, you got to get these guys under control. If we want true liberty and equality, we got to get these agitators to basically lay off. And these letters actually backfire, and it kind of isolates Lafayette. now, because now the Parisian radicals basically say, look, you're just here to save the king and you're going to betray the revolution. You are just writing these letters because you don't trust us. And so if he was still playing the middle and the king still had power, this would be okay. This wouldn't be a big problem. But very soon after, about a month or two after this is when we get the fall of the monarchy. So a mob of revolutionaries and rebel National Guards, so there you go right there, people that he was commanding, switch sides. Well, not even switch sides, but pick a side, I should say. Storm the palace, they massacre the Swiss Guard, the king is dethroned, and the monarchy is officially abolished in what we call the violent Second Revolution. And so in the aftermath, this radical government is put together. They declare that Lafayette should be arrested as a traitor. Danton and Robespierre are now basically running the show, and they've got Lafayette and a huge list of other aristocrats who they mean to prosecute for treason and then eventually execute them. So thankfully Lafayette's not in the city, but he realizes like, oh my God, my head's going to be on a pike if I come back to Paris. But this is just how quickly things change. He's been playing the middle, but unfortunately now one side has won, and that side does not like him, especially after he's been writing all these letters about the Jacobins. And so, yeah, he's on, very high up on Paris's most wanted list, at this point.
Yeah, optically speaking, it's a tough position to be in. So here's Lafayette. He's a known royal sympathizer in some respect, and now he is also on record of being an outspoken critic of the Jacobins. At this point, he's essentially a marked man, and then this new extremist government, the Paris Commune and this kind of Jacobin-dominated assembly, declares Lafayette a traitor to the revolution. And there was actually, some talk of summoning him to Paris to stand trial, which I would imagine almost certainly meant meeting the guillotine or some sort of execution. And this is where, his life kind of takes a very drastic turn. And, sensing the doom closing in, he makes a very fateful choice. He decides to flee France.
Yeah, which is kind of crazy because, this is Lafayette. He's Mr. France, I feel like at this point. He's been fighting for liberty and equality, and he's now an outcast in his own country. And so, like you said, he's fighting on the border, and, good thing for him is he has an American citizenship too. So he can potentially think, hey, maybe I can get to America. But again, his family is still in Paris, so we have to consider that. So him and a few other nobles try to essentially get into Austria, and he's essentially arrested. And he's actually they see him as the instigator of the French Revolution. So you have to remember, the Austrians and the Prussians, they're invading France to crush this revolution, make sure the monarchy stays in place. Like you mentioned before, Richie, they don't want to set a precedent here. They see Lafayette as an instigator of the French Revolution. So again, he's trying to play the middle. Both sides hate him. And now he's being held as a prisoner of state. So a prisoner of state is worse than a prisoner of war. Prisoner of war, there's some laws around what you can do. Prisoner of state is basically, we can do whatever the heck we want with you. And so this is where he tries to say, hey, look, I'm an American citizen here. You don't want to be locking up an American citizen. You're neutral with that country. And they go, yeah, nice try, buddy. You are the instigator of the revolution. We're going to imprison you in a fortress called Olmütz. And he's going to be there for 5 years. And this is not just, hey, he's put in a house somewhere and he's under house arrest. No, this is like dungeon, small cell, dripping water in the corner, rats running around. This is horrendous for him, and he's there for 5 long years. And so think of like solitary confinement. He's getting so sick, losing weight. He's on the point here where like his health is going to deteriorate significantly, and he's never really going to fully recover from all of this. So this happens for about 5 years, and we'll get into some of the details in a second. But it's important to remember now, back in France, the reign of terror is in fully going at this point, and Lafayette's family becomes a target. So his wife Adrienne is arrested in 1794, along with her mother, grandmother, and sister are captured by the Jacobins and locked up in the Luxembourg Palace. And so you have to set the scene too. So we have Lafayette in Austria imprisoned. He has no idea what's happening in the outside world. He has no idea what's happened to his family. Adrienne, on the other hand, is now a captive. And every day she thinks that knock at the door is going to happen. They're going to open it up and say, off with your head. Can you imagine the psychological torture of that? Like, I was thinking about this just as I was reading, and I was like, she has literally waking up every day thinking this could be the last day for me and for my children. And unfortunately for Adrienne, it's the last day for her mother, grandmother, and sister. They are all guillotined. And, this is just, like, again, it's grandmother, sister. These people have nothing to do with what's happening, but they represent what the Jacobins hate. And so they're essentially cutting off all of these heads. It's just a horrible, horrible time. But thankfully, the people of Paris are like, hey, this is getting a little bit ridiculous. And things are starting to slow down. And thankfully, during this time, all of Lafayette's American friends who are in Europe are fighting on their behalf. And actually, they are able to save Adrienne and her kids' lives by basically pleading with the Jacobins, saying, look, they're Americans, or they're the wife and kids of an American citizen. If you do this, we're going to make a big stink about this. And so they're able to keep her alive. And then eventually, as things kind of calm down, she's released and is able to go on her way. But, it's just that close. Lafayette has no idea what's going on. He's still locked up, and Adrienne's living every day thinking that it might be her last. And, outside of the terrible blood and torture and everything that's happening, the psychological torture that happened to her and her kids, I can not even imagine.
Yeah, it's a devastating story, but it's also a story of devotion in the weirdest way. So I know, Paul, you just mentioned about her mother, grandmother, and sister all being executed. And it's interesting. Something I came across was, why wasn't she executed? They could have easily executed her. And in some ways, maybe it was Robespierre's calculation that executing Lafayette's wife might actually antagonize the United States. So he spared her. And on your point about the kind of U.S. compatriots intervening on behalf of Lafayette. So this is interesting. It is the intervention of U.S. envoy James Monroe and his wife, who personally advocated for her. And that's how she was able to actually get out of jail. And then she actually arranged for her son, George Washington Lafayette, to be smuggled safely to America under George Washington's protection. And then with her daughter, she'd actually set out across war-torn Europe to seek her husband's release.
Yeah, this is where we really get into Adrienne, I think, being the star of the show for a little bit here. So, like you said, she's doing so much work to try to get him out of prison. There's actually an escape attempt that is organized. Lafayette actually gets out of the prison, and two men basically give him a horse, some money, and he's supposed to ride to one town, but he doesn't understand. In the heat of the commotion, rides to another town, shows up, and everyone's like, who's this guy speaking really harsh, terrible German with a big French accent? And eventually they figure it out, and they lock him back up, and they lock him up like real good this time. So he's not in a good state already, and now he's stuck in kind of worse conditions. But like you said, so many people are supporting him. They're writing to the Austrian government. They're trying to get him out. The Americans can't do anything in a formal sense because, look, this is, between the French and the Austrians. They can't necessarily intervene, but they can give money behind closed doors. They can do all of these things. And Adrienne, she does that. She goes right to I can't remember, it's either the Austrians or the Prussians, because they're moving them back and forth. But she essentially goes to the emperor and says, look, free him, please. He's got nothing to do with what's going on. Like, they hate him back in France. We're just going to go to America. We're going to get out of here. And he goes, I can't do that. I've promised that I will keep him locked up. And then she says, well, all right, put me in prison with him and my daughters. And the emperor goes, fine, no problem. So she goes to Olmütz and is locked up with Lafayette, not like in the same cell, like in adjacent cells where they can talk to each other, but she chooses to go live in these horrible, horrible conditions just because she doesn't want to be away from her husband. And she even brings her kids with her, which is even crazier to me that she would do this. And can you imagine Lafayette has no idea what's going on? All of a sudden he hears like a knock at the door, and it's his wife and daughters. It's just, it must have, blown his mind. And, I imagine the tears and the excitement, but also like the terror of, oh my God, it's great that she's safe, but now she's got to live this life with me. And I think it's incredibly noble and brave of Adrienne to do this, and a little crazy as far as I'm concerned. But for her, like, living in Paris wasn't really safe for her, I guess, for her safety and for knowing just the mental element that she knows that her husband is safe, being right beside him, even though it's in horrible conditions, I guess kind of works for her.
Yeah, I think in many ways. So it was the Austrian emperor that granted her request of shared captivity. I guess you can frame it that way. But I think in many ways, her sacrifice probably saved Lafayette to endure those harsh conditions in captivity. And she did so for 2 years. That's how long they were in prison together out of his 5-year sentence.
Yeah, it's not a short period of time, and it will take a toll on her. And we'll see later how, it's really hot during the day, freezing cold at night, not a lot of sunlight, and just the mental anguish that they're going through. It's not a good place to be. But in a kind of one way, it kind of saved Lafayette's life being locked up. If he was back in Paris or even back in France, he would have been dead a long time ago. The Jacobins, they didn't like him. He was very high up on that list, and they would have executed him. But thankfully for Lafayette, as a young man in Paris named Napoleon Bonaparte, we may have heard of him. He is now ravaging Europe with his new army and defeats the Austrians. And one of the things that Napoleon says is, look, all right, part of the peace deal, give me Lafayette and those other guys back that you guys have had locked up. And they're like, well, I'm not so sure we can do that. And then he goes, no, you're going to do that because I'm Napoleon and, I'm dictating the terms here. And so the Austrian emperor goes, all right, look, I'll release him, but it's not because Napoleon told me. I'm doing it in good faith to our American friends. And they're like, all right, great. You can say what you want, but Lafayette's free. But he can't return home. France is ruled by something called the Directory now, which is a lot of former Jacobins, and they still consider him a suspect and banish him from French soil. So he actually has to live in exile in northern Germany in a neutral area with his family, watching from afar as, Napoleon starts to gain more power. Lafayette refuses Bonaparte's offer of a passport under a false name. He says, look, I'm not sneaking into my own country like a criminal. I'm going to bide my time and I'm going to wait. And, a lot of people might be saying, well, why doesn't he just go to America at this point? You got to remember, you can't just hop on a plane and get over there. It's a long, difficult journey. He's in bad health. Adrienne's in worse health. They're not going to survive if they try to cross the Atlantic. So at this point, they're just trying to get back to France and try to live out their life. And yeah, maybe at some point they'll try to get to America. But, at this point, they're just buying their time. And eventually, Napoleon will have his coup d'etat, topple the Directory, establish him as quote unquote first consul, dictator of France, if you will. Really, the first version of the French Revolution is over. Napoleon's in power, and now, Lafayette is, invited back. As long as he doesn't stir up any trouble is kind of the condition that he's under.
I think this marks a very interesting point in his life, right? So he's been in jail. He's seeing the revolution, take its course. Napoleon is now on the scene and he has some options. But to your point, Paul, none of them are very easy to actually execute against. Even, President Jefferson, a friend to both men, actually offered Lafayette a governorship of Louisiana in 1803, likely with Napoleon dissent. But again, Lafayette declined. He wanted at this point to retire to private life rather than, serve an authoritarian regime as which he kind of saw Napoleon as representing. So he continued to keep a low profile until he actually wrote this to, who did he write this to? I think it was to Jefferson. I shall wait out these despotic years, he wrote to a friend, making clear he saw Napoleon's government as a betrayal of the revolution's ideal. Napoleon, in turn, so this is a very interesting relationship, in turn deemed Lafayette a well-meaning relic. Reportedly, the emperor once mused that Lafayette had been in charge in the 1790s. Quote unquote, the king would still be on his throne, suggesting Lafayette was too moderate to fully unleash a revolution. So it's a very interesting kind of, polarization between these two.
Yeah, definitely. And I've got an interesting passage here from an author named Shannon Selin, who wrote a book about Napoleon in Paris. And just a little point about when they had an exchange. And he basically says, Napoleon to Lafayette, he says, you must have found the French looking very coldly upon liberty. And Lafayette replies, yes, but they are in a condition to receive it. It is for you to give it. It is from you that it is expected. And so she kind of writes that he kind of frowns and goes, all right, this is weird way of responding, but and then they kind of get back together again, and Napoleon complains at Lafayette's outspoken comments against the government. Give its enemies the weight of your name. And Lafayette answers, I certainly wish to be prudent, but I shall not be false. Whenever anyone asks if your regime conforms to my ideas of liberty, I shall answer that it does not. So Lafayette's being very open and honest here. He doesn't like the way Napoleon's going here, but like you mentioned, Richie, he's decided, he's also promised Adrienne, he's going to take it easy. They're going to live on their farm. They're going to do what they need to do. And he's not going to get into political life. And he's actually offered situations where he can come into appointed posts and those sort of things. And he says, no. He's like, no, I don't want to do that. I've made a promise here. I'm staying out of this. But, he's still a French noble. So when it comes time to vote on things, for example, when Napoleon wanted public ratification to his consul for life, Lafayette was very public and said, no, I'm not voting for that. He says, I cannot vote for such a magistracy until public liberty has been sufficiently guaranteed. And so this really does not make the relationship was already rocky to begin with, and now I think this pushes him over the line. And yeah, he's just staying out of things. He doesn't want to go to run the Louisiana territory, even though he's offered it, and he's just kind of waiting things out, like you mentioned, Richie. So I know we're getting close to the hour mark here, but Lafayette just, we were joking before, the guy just keeps living and doing stuff. And so it'll be a long episode today, but we're going to talk a little bit more now about, the kind of the back end of his life, but some interesting stuff that happens here. And unfortunately, though, we've been kind of prefacing this, Adrienne's been in really poor health. She's at the age of 48, and we think it's tuberculosis. Finally takes her, and she passes away at the age of 48 on December 24th, 1807. And this actually makes, you'll see Lafayette right in the future. Every time Christmas comes along, it's a really difficult time for him because he remembers, it's the Christmas season. And, this is when his beloved passes away. And he says, he's heartbroken. He says, I am now indeed in exile, for my heart has lost its homeland. And so Lafayette, buries Adrienne in Paris. And if you actually go to Paris today, you'll see Adrienne buried on one side, and Lafayette is buried right beside her. And so actually Napoleon, to his credit, he actually respects Adrienne, allows a large funeral to be done in dignity. And, he kind of, Lafayette withdraws and really just kind of deals with this. And, it's just a really difficult moment for him, especially everything that she's done for him, everything she's been there from his side. Remember, they met as kids, right? These were two kids that they didn't know they were supposed to be together, and then they found out and they've lived this life. And it's a really sad end to her life, but it's interesting in the sense that Lafayette made a promise to Adrienne, and he kept that promise. I will not get back into politics until for every day that we're together, we will be together. And now she's gone. Right? As much as this hurts, there's going to be a new fire that's going to be lit in Lafayette. And he's going to see an opportunity to get back into that ring. But, this one, I think, it hurts for him and it hurts for the people of France because I think they lost, one of the good people who, managed to get out of the revolution by the skin of her teeth, but sacrificed so much of her life for, her husband and ultimately, to the goodness of France. So like we said, he's got that fire in his heart, but, Napoleon's still in power and they're not, great friends, but it's 1814, 1815. Everything that we've talked about with Napoleon has kind of happened, and he's eventually defeated at Waterloo, and Lafayette gets right in there. He kind of helps this, I guess you could call it parliamentary coup, where they topple the emperor for the second and final time. And, it's time for the next version of this. And the only way we're going to do this is bring back the monarchy. So the Bourbon monarchy is restored. King Louis XVIII is now in power. Older man. But, Lafayette's becoming this elder statesman, and he thinks this is a great opportunity now. What we're going to do is we're going to bring the king back, and we're going to have more of this liberal sort of setup, get to that constitutional monarchy. He's consistently speaking out again for freedom, of the press, religious equality, all the things that he's been doing. But again, the royalists don't like him. They're doing little sneaky ways of making sure he loses elections. He's not, really powerful. And so Lafayette just keeps encouraging more liberal movements around Europe. So until he can do some things in France, so he's supporting the Italians, the Spanish, there's Greek independence from the Ottomans. And he's really trying to, get this done. But there's a lot of things that are happening, like the French intervene in the Spanish Revolution to try to keep the Spanish king in power. He's not a fan of this, Lafayette, because he's like, they're trying to self-determine and we're getting involved. I'm totally against this. There's new laws that disenfranchise many liberal voters, and it's just not a good time for France. He was very excited to say, hey, Napoleon's gone. We can bring the king back. We can reset, but it kind of just falls back into not so much revolution, but into, the royalists are back. They want blood too. They're going after a lot of these radicals that were there, people who were loyal to Napoleon. And again, Lafayette manages to survive this just because he was very outspoken against Napoleon. But again, he's now in this limbo again where he really doesn't have much power. He's not sure what he wants to do. He actually starts authoring a journal where he gets a lot of liberal thinkers to come together and write, but he's not sure what to do. And then one day he gets a letter. President James Monroe says, hey, it's the 50th anniversary of American independence, which just goes to show how old Lafayette is getting now. It's the 50th anniversary of American independence. Why don't you come to the U.S. for a few months? We'll take you around. We'll set you up in a nice place, and you'll be able to see kind of what America's become. And he goes, yeah, let's do that. And so this is the beginning of, a much more joyous time in Lafayette's life.
Yeah, this grand tour is it's very unique, and it probably turned into one of the most kind of extraordinary celebrations that time this young nation had ever seen. So he arrives in August of 1824 to a thundering 13-gun salute. And then over the next 13 months, he traveled through all 24 states. He even extended his tour beyond the original 13 because so many people wanted to invite him. The country was kind of seized in Lafayette mania. So we're talking about, parades, malicious salutes, lavish banquets in his honor. And in Washington, he was invited to address a joint session of Congress, making him the first foreign citizen to ever do so. And Congress even voted to grant him a gift of $200,000 and a large tract of land, which I think is in Florida, in recognition of his services to American independence. And what else did he do? So he even visited Mount Vernon, and he wept at George Washington's tomb. He spent a silent hour in contemplation of his departed mentor. And in Boston, he actually laid the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument, standing alongside with aged veterans of 1775 while a crowd of 200,000 looked on. And this is where he's kind of feted as the last founding father, the living embodiment of America's founding ideals, coming back to bless the nation. So it is a very, symbolic, powerful tour that he's on.
I like to think of it's like the first Beatlemania, right? He comes over and there's so many firsts, like you said, the speaking in Congress. He's walking down Broadway in New York City and to this great fanfare, and that kind of sets all these little precedents. But I think the most interesting thing was this was only supposed to be a 4-month stay, and he ends up extending it to 14 months. And like you said, 24 states and 6,000 miles, as a man in his late 70s whose, health hasn't been great, but, he's able to visit Thomas Jefferson, who's now 81, and they're able to just finally see each other again and talk. He visits John Adams, who's at the very end of his life, and who basically says, look, I am so sick and old, but if you want to come by and we can have a chat, that would be great. He's getting spoon-fed by his family and stuff. He's really on the very last days of his life, but he's so happy to see Lafayette. And I just think of what a change this must be for him. He's just come from being hated really by everybody, but trying to do the right thing. And now he's in a world where everybody agrees with him. And he's, like you said, he's a rock star. This is, when we go around the United States, you have Lafayette Square in Washington. This is because he shows up and he does this. He helps lay down a monument at Bunker Hill. And so he's just so ingrained, within America. And I think it's super interesting. But I love, though, he meets up with some of these older founding fathers. He's the last of the generals that are left, and the founding fathers are very, very old. He still lets them have it when it comes to slavery. He comes back and goes, look, I love this country. Everything's great. But why do you still have slaves, Thomas Jefferson? And, he's getting the whole thing around. We all agree with you in principle, but the political aspects and, all those arguments. But, these are old friends. He's going to let them have it, as guys do. We're going to get on each other. He's going to be like, hey, it was great coming into your slave plantation here, Jefferson, but what are you doing, man? Come on. And so you start to see a lot of that. But again, he's having the time of his life. He's going around. Everybody's, really excited to see him. And, he returns home with a little bit of soil from Bunker Hill, which he'll actually be used when he's buried. They bury him under American soil, which I think is kind of cool within Paris. But yeah, it's nice to see that he's able to do this and actually enjoy himself, for the first time, I feel like, in a long time.
It's a I don't want to say a nice end, but it's a very powerful symbolic end, because I think it's the last big thing he does, because he passes away. He retires again in 1830, and then in 1834 at the age of 76, which is incredible given what he's gone through. He passes away in Paris, and then he's actually buried under the American soil from Bunker Hill, which is sprinkled in his grave. And yeah, I think, in many ways, I think it was President Andrew Jackson who proclaimed that Lafayette was a citizen of the whole world, especially of ours. And I think it is a great epitaph for fans of history to kind of see him that way, because he definitely was.
Absolutely. And even when he comes back to, you see, there's another revolution. They put in a new leader, Citizen King, everything looks great. And then it just starts to fade away a little bit more. And Lafayette's at the center, he's trying to help everything along, but he never gets to see France truly become that liberal republic that he was hoping for. It happens about, the monarchy is abolished about, I think, 10 or 15 years after he dies. But yeah, there's even a ton left when he comes back. But there's a great quote here from John Quincy Adams that he mentions. He was Secretary of State at the time, and the son of John Adams. He delivers this farewell address when Lafayette's leaving. And I think it just goes to show how loved he was in America. And again, it really establishes his legacy. He says, "We shall look upon you always as belonging to us during the whole of our life, and as belonging to our children after us. You are ours by more than patriotic self-devotion with which you flew to the aid of our fathers at the crisis of our fate. Ours by that unshaken gratitude for your service. Ours by that tie of love, stronger than death, which has linked your name for the endless ages of the time with the name of Washington." So he's basically saying, look, you've done so much for us. We put you up there with Washington. You were on that level. And I think that just goes to show where he stands with America. But I also find it so interesting that he could have gone back to America so many points and just lived this life as a rock star and been able to be within this world. And, I'm sure he would have been in the abolitionist movement and done all of these interesting things. But at heart, he still wanted to see his mother country become what America was from a setup standpoint, be a true liberal democracy. And he never quite gets there, but, he fights to the very last day to make sure that happens. And eventually it does, which I think is, I always love reading about these people and saying, like, if we brought him back today and took him through the history after he died, what would he think? I would think he'd be pretty happy and pretty proud of what he's done, but, didn't quite get to see it. But, the Americans definitely at least were able to say to him in his life, thank you for everything you've done. And, America wouldn't be America without him, which I think is kind of crazy because we talked about in the first episode, the French being involved changed the tide of that war and, made America what it is. So I think that's just, he's Lafayette. What can you say, really?
Lafayette, he's a liberal icon. He's an idealistic nobleman who championed human rights and constitutional government. And I think the most interesting thing for me is that he found himself in a situation motivated by ideals, but couldn't necessarily control the forces of revolution that he ended up unleashing. And I think that's what makes his story so fascinating.
I love that. Yeah. And he never wavered. He always stuck to those principles. And yeah, I think it's an inspiring person to look up to for sure. I think he's pretty awesome. And I think we've done him justice with these 2 episodes, but I think it's time to say goodbye to the Marquis and we'll move on to something else next time. So I thank you all if you've made it through both episodes, and I hope you walk away with feeling the same way as we do about Lafayette. But we'll be back in a couple of weeks doing something else, and we'll see what that is. And I hope you'll join us for that one.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.